Today we're talking with Coleen Rowley, the FBI agent who blew the lid off of the preparations or the lack thereof by the United States government in planning for the 9/11 attacks. Welcome, Coleen, to Whistle Where You Work.
Well, thanks for having me.
Coleen, where did you grow up?
Iowa, in a small farm town.
And tell me about your educational background.
Went to college. I majored in French. I went on to law school, graduated from the University of Iowa Law School, and then pretty quickly joined the FBI, which had been my goal all along since about 5th grade.
And when did you do that?
Joined the FBI in January of 1981. And then I was assigned to Jackson, Mississippi, Omaha, and eventually New York City, where I worked on mafia cases for 6.5 years. And then in 1990, I got transferred to Minneapolis, where I became the legal counsel for the office, and a lot of different hats, freedom of information and victim witness, but mostly I taught FBI agents constitutional law.
And when did you first become aware of Zacarias Moussaoui?
I got called at night, woke me up. Actually, didn't wake me up, but I was already in bed, about 9 o'clock. That's very unusual for agents to call me at home at the time. Maybe only happened a couple of times in my whole career.
And what year are we talking about here?
This would have been August, I think, 16th of 2001. And they had just taken him into custody, and the supervisor at the time, acting supervisor, gave me some short facts. And actually, he said, I think we really have something here. And, of course, I said, yes, my goodness. But at the time, there were questions about whether they could go any further on the searching.
What had triggered the agent's interest in him?
They had been called from the flight school in Egan because the two different the instructors, the flight instructors, were extremely suspicious. And a lot of people know that, it's one fact, but no, it was a lot of reasons. He had paid in cash, and he had made up excuses for why he wanted to learn to fly. A lot of this now is revealed in Chapter 8 of the 9/11 Commission report.
In August 2001, Moussaoui was detained by immigration officials, wasn't he?
Well, that was what he was detained by, was the Joint Terrorism Task Force that night that they called me.
Gotcha.
And that included INS, and that gave the reason, because his visa had expired. So, in a way, he was detained because of the expired visa, but that was not the reason. He was detained, they were afraid that he had the trappings and the markings of a dangerous, person, and certainly indications that he was could be a terrorist suspect.
And so what did you do with this information?
Well, they were asking me what they could do in terms of searching, and the law at the time, now I've come under some criticism for not saying, go ahead, it's an emergency. Now, this would have been August 16th, the first time I get the call. And the law at the time is to play it safer and seek a warrant. And then you then have to consider whether it should be a criminal warrant or under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the intelligence world. And before 9/11, there were all kinds of issues with the wall that separated the intelligence from the criminal. At the time, we decided, and it wasn't just myself, it was also FBI headquarters, that the better route was to attempt to get a FISA warrant through the intelligence for a lot of reasons. And so the agents then set about doing that. They put the facts down, and within a couple of days, they worked really around the clock. They had a real many-paged draft declaration of facts that they sent to our headquarters to get an emergency, not just a FISA, but an emergency FISA.
And when was this?
Well, August 16th to, I think, 18th. So it's right around the 18th that these facts, or 19th, somewhere in there, that they would have gotten them. The same time that they sent a draft declaration, they also sent out leads to both Great Britain and France for doing background. The agents, really did everything just very timely and very astute. They were very astute. You just can't, praise their work more. As well as the flight instructors. I should mention that the real whistleblowers initially were the flight instructors who called the FBI. They went against their bosses. So when you mix the government and the private, this story really is a great example of where private whistleblowers need protection, because they went against their bosses, who, of course, Moussaoui was a paying customer.
And a cash-paying customer at that.
And flight schools have lost those customers. In fact, I think this flight school has gone out of business. So you can see how everybody along here did the right thing up until...
Now, that's what I wanted to get to. What did headquarters do with the information you sent them?
Well, again, you had this mixture of human error and not really doing some mistakes and wrong things, as well as a misunderstanding of the law. The wall had grown so high. That turns out later, FISA Court of Appeals says that was never correct understanding of the law. But at the time, the people at headquarters believed that the probable cause was not there. The 9/11 Commission report, it's kind of hard to talk about what they understood unless you tell about what the mistakes were. One of the mistakes that the 9/11 Commission report found out was that they didn't understand that the fact that Moussaoui was working for the Chechens, that was a foreign group. When you go to the FISA court, you have to say that you're working on behalf of a foreign power or a terrorist group. And our headquarters people didn't recognize that the Chechens could have been described as a foreign power or a foreign terrorist group. That was one mistake. There was more mistakes. One other mistake that's really never been talked about much is that the legal person in the FBI, the unit chief, never read the declaration. Grassley in the...
What would they have learned had they read
it?
Yeah.
These facts, again, it's a multi-page declaration, and I won't be able to recite all of them, but there were such things as paying in cash. And when the suspicious flight instructor questioned him about being Islam or whatever, Moussaoui had said things that didn't make sense. He did have certain interest in parts of the plane that were weird. His background in being a private pilot made no sense. What the sum of it was that the flight instructor, and again, you have to rely on an expert like that in the field. If you're an FBI agent and he's a flight instructor who's taught for 20 years, and he says to you, yes, this is one of the most suspicious students I've ever had, or the most suspicious. No, that counts for a lot, because I'm an FBI agent. How would I know what is suspicious? But you are the flight instructor, and it wasn't just one. Okay, so all of these things in total, probable cause under this case law of Gates and stuff is that you look at all the facts together. Now, when the draft declaration went into headquarters, another mistake was that the person at headquarters rewrote portions of it. And of course, I was in tune to that because our FBI laboratory, Frederick Whitehurst, that was something he pointed to. When his scientific reports would get slightly aggrandized or slightly changed, and that's not right. If you do your report, and it's my science report, so your boss is going to rewrite a few words. Well, this draft declaration, that happened. The person at headquarters was changed 3 or 4 things. So all of this led to the thing, and the fact that the unit chief did not read it was another huge problem. You can imagine, how can you say it's not probable cause? What if you went into a judge and to sign something and later on found he hadn't read it? I mean, that's how bad this was. So after 9/11, of course, then nobody was revealing these very human errors. And we know the rest of the story because when the truth did not come out after 9/11 about some of these things, what happened, what rushes in to fill a vacuum? The wrong approaches, rounding up immigrants. Very quickly after 9/11, they instituted the harsh interrogation tactics. Was that a problem? I mean, come on. I mean, there is just a whole number of things, and that's the reason why truth is really a key thing, and especially in a national security environment.
In 2002, you wrote to FBI Director Robert Mueller a letter, and you said that you were concerned at the time that the agency was misrepresenting some of the facts surrounding what had happened in the run-up to 9/11. What motivated you to write this letter?
Well, at that time, they had started a Joint Intelligence Committee inquiry under a Pentagon analyst, Eleanor Hill. And there were staff, and we were all being called. It was kind of surprising I was even called to come back. And the reason I was called is because this legal issue of probable cause kind of figured in. I think that was the reason I got called. But also in that interim, they had a timetable of events had been set to paper, and the timetable left out some of the more embarrassing facts. Like this great example is, did you read the affidavit? That you'll not find that in the timetable. And yet other things that kind of backed up, there's no probable cause, there's nothing we could have done, that was in there. So when I got that call, it was a long story, but for like 2 days I didn't even sleep because I thought, oh, I'm going to forget all these issues. And so then I just started jotting it down because I didn't want to forget when I talked to them. But as soon as I got about 7-8 pages written, I thought, you know what, it's 8.5 months later, look at the course we're on, and a lot of it's because the truth is not known. I'm going to put down everything I know in here in a comprehensive way as best as I can in 2 days. And then I'm going to give it to our internal affairs, the FBI's own internal affairs, because I thought this actually required a closer look, and give it to the director. And I also copied, at the last minute, the 2 senators that I knew were on that committee, Feinstein and Shelby. And the only reason I put them on, they weren't the heads of it, I put them on because I'd seen in the paper that they were asking questions.
Did anybody respond to your letter?
Well, the response came very quickly because in a day or two, I think it was about 48 hours, someone, probably in Congress, shared it with CNN and with Time Magazine or New York Times. And so then our office got called by, I think, CNN initially, and they said, oh, there's something about a memo. I went, oh, no, that must be the same memo. But I myself did not take it to the press. I took it internally, and what was shocking was I took this to people who certainly got secret clearances, the people on the intelligence committees, Feinstein and Shelby, in a closed envelope, and yet the FBI afterwards classified it and was talking about firing me for taking it to people with clearances. And I was shocked about that. I mean, I was in the FBI for 21 years at this time, legal counsel, and I couldn't believe that this would come to the point where they would talk about firing me for just sharing it with an intelligence committee. It's
and you did speak before a Senate committee, and you also spoke before the 9/11 Commission.
No, I did not speak to the 9/11 Commission.
You didn't?
No. They were under severe time constraints. And so all of Chapter 8, which is the system was was blinking red or something. The system was blinking red. That is all from Eleanor Hills and the Joint Intelligence Committee and the IG investigation that my complaint gave rise to. So Glenn Fine in the Department of Justice did a 400-page report for 2 years on my letter that stemmed from my letter. And that was used by the 9/11 Commission.
And before we go back briefly to talk about how you were treated at the FBI after this letter, tell me about the lessons you think we should be learning from 9/11.
Well, the lessons are, the largest lesson here is to get to the truth quickly. The terrorists are a lot more flexible than we are. Maybe it's because they're more decisive and there's only a few of them. I don't know. They don't have a bureaucracy. I don't know. But they mess up, for instance, on their first attack of the World Trade Center, and they go back at it a second time. And right now with aviation, everybody's thinking that they're going to do the things the same way. Probably not. The next attack will be different. We're slow, first of all, to even tell the truth about the mistake, let alone then analyze why it happened and then go back to the drawing board. And I think that's our Achilles heel. The war on terror was a wrong metaphor. I think that's another problem because this wasn't a war. It should have been treated as an effort to reduce and limit, terrorism. But when that vacuum existed and, it allowed the leaders at the time to come in and say, oh, we're going to declare war. Well, on who? What, Al-Qaeda are terrorists that are scattered all over the world, but we started launching bombs on a couple of countries. And then, of course, to have used tactics that don't even work, such as torture and warrantless monitoring and this massive intelligence. The mistakes, I talk on this topic, and it's like hours just to go through the litany of things that have happened since 9/11. But it all stems back to if you had people, first of all, listen to people initially before it even happened. There wasn't just the Minneapolis FBI talking about finding a terrorist. There were other things out there. They had talked about bolting cockpit doors in other contexts before this. And so if the people had been listened to, first of all, you might have prevented or at least minimized 9/11. And then second of all, when a mistake does happen and the worst does happen, then get to the truth as quickly as possible and figure out what went wrong instead of this constant suppression in order to prevent embarrassment from people, being, losing I don't know if they would have lost their jobs. Every single person after 9/11 who was involved and frankly didn't do that was promoted.
And you were threatened with being fired.
Well, I originally was, but the media, it's a double-edged sword. But because Time magazine came out within a week or so and had my picture on the cover, the Agents Association, of course, who knew all this was true, backed me. Senators Grassley, Leahy, Wellstone, and Mark Dayton. I took all of these things, and, again, a lot of luck. I feel kind of bad when I talk to whistleblower groups because I am kind of a lucky one compared to so many others, and I don't know how it happened that I lucked out, but I had a lot of support, and it got me through that whistleblowing memo. Now, I kept going, though, because after 9/11, then all these other things kept happening. So I kept speaking out, and I found different ways through pre-publication review. I wrote a chapter about the war on terror and civil liberties, and there were different things I did. And eventually, and I knew I was getting close to retirement, so I thought, well, okay, if I can push the envelope. And, from an integrity standpoint, people often come up to me and say, thank you for what you did, as if it's over. Well, I said, no, it's not over until this gets back on course. I have this little button stop torture, for instance, things like that. Until it actually totally put those evils in the Pandora box back in, and we can actually say we're kind of back on course, I don't think it's over.
Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen, and with me is Peter Nesbitt, who has a very interesting story about what happens when two planes converge over an airport. What's going to be done about it? Are you safe? Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Where are you from?
Oak Ridge, Tennessee is where I call home. Mm-hmm. Currently living in Austin, Texas.
Mm-hmm. And tell me about your professional background.
I started off in the United States Air Force as an air traffic controller and was fortunate enough to be hired with the FAA after my tour with the Air Force, and have been with the FAA ever since. I've worked in Louisville, Kentucky, Oakland, California, Dallas, Texas, Memphis, and now Austin.
Okay, and let me talk to you a little bit about something that happened in Memphis when you were on duty. Tell me about what is a go-around.
A go-around can either be controller or pilot initiated, and it's generally to avoid an unsafe situation. It could be another aircraft on the runway, a mechanical malfunction, something of that nature, but it's essentially to avoid a potential problem.
Okay, and a potential problem would be potential collision in the air, crash on the ground, what?
It could be an aircraft crossing the runway unexpected. It could be an unsafe gear indication. It could be a vehicle on the runway, any of a number of different things. If the runway is not clear for an aircraft to land, the aircraft must execute a go-around.
And how often do go-arounds happen?
It's a fairly common thing. It does happen, and sometimes it's not an unusual maneuver or an unsafe maneuver, but sometimes go-arounds do conflict with other airplanes.
Mm-hmm. And what happens when the reason for the go-around is converging airlines?
Well, in an instance that I observed at Memphis, an aircraft executed a go-around one evening, and there was another aircraft on approach to a converging runway. They were intersecting flight paths. Mm-hmm. And so when the first aircraft executed the go-around, it flew into the flight path of the other airplane landing on a converging approach path. And as a result of that go-around, the second aircraft was forced to be issued go-around instructions as well to avoid a collision. But the FAA doesn't really prescribe separation for go-around maneuvers like that, and that's kind of the problem. They leave it up to controllers our pilots to visually separate those airplanes.
I see. So what did you do?
Well, I wasn't responsible for working the airplanes involved. I was working in a ground control position, but I was standing next to the controller that was responsible for that position, and I saw it firsthand. And when it happened, when the aircraft executed the go-around, the air traffic controller was standing next to me immediately told the pilot to stay low, stay low, stay low, in order to avoid the airplane that was flying overhead from right to left.
And did you report this to anybody?
Yeah, I was very disturbed by it. It was the closest that I had ever seen two airplanes come to one another. So when I was relieved and went downstairs on a break, I filed a report with the NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System, which is an online anonymous reporting system for pilots, controllers, crew members, mechanics to report unsafe practices, incidents, or events within the aviation system.
And then what happened?
Nothing. It was quiet for a few days. I read about an NTSB runway safety forum that was coming up, and I felt that this was a runway safety issue. It was an air traffic control issue. So I then reported the issue to the NTSB and asked for their assistance.
NTSB is?
I'm sorry, the National Transportation Safety Board.
Mm-hmm.
They generally investigate accidents, and so I felt this would be a great time for them to investigate something before the accident happened. Let's prevent the accident.
And did they?
Well, it's my understanding. I never received an official verification of this, but I was told that the NTSB forwarded my complaint to the FAA, and that it eventually made its way to FAA safety and or FAA oversight, and an investigation was conducted at some point.
And what was the effect of that investigation?
Well, air traffic controllers at Memphis have been told for a number of years that there was a waiver that allowed this particular operation to exist. We had asked to see the waiver on a number of instances. We're always told that the waiver was stored at another location. They couldn't provide us with an actual copy of it, but the waiver did exist. But at the end of the investigation by FAA safety and FAA oversight, it was disclosed that a waiver did, in fact, not exist, and that the operation was illegal and unsafe, and that Memphis needed to immediately stop running this operation.
So, slam dunk victory. I suppose that you were celebrated by your supervisors, right?
Not really.
So what happened?
The facility was upset. In my opinion, they were upset. I felt that they were embarrassed. They had a little egg on their face due to this constant story of a waiver existing. There were several airlines that operate into Memphis Airport that were upset because the airport capacity was reduced. Instead of landing on three runways, we could only land on 2 runways at a time. So it did affect some of the users, and there was the question of safety over profit, or profit over safety, however you want to look at it.
And how did they treat you?
Well, it was shortly after that I was subjected to various acts of retaliation. In my opinion, I was accused of animal cruelty.
Animal cruelty.
I was accused of animal cruelty by one FAA manager. I was accused of insubordination. I was accused of being reckless at work. I was accused of poor work performance. There was just a whole series of false accusations that I was subjected to after having worked at Memphis for almost a year to a year and a half as being a model employee and an excellent air traffic controller. But suddenly, after making the safety disclosure, suddenly I was a poor performer.
And so what became of all those allegations against you?
After dealing with this for approximately 7 to 8 months, I finally contacted the Office of Special Counsel. I submitted a whistleblower retaliation complaint package for prohibited personnel practice. They were very interested in the prohibited personnel practice as well as the safety disclosures, and they asked me to split my case into 2 parts, to have a PPP case as well as a safety disclosure case, which I agreed to do. And then as a result of that, there were some additional safety disclosures that were made to the OSC, which were finally investigated by the FAA.
And what's the status of the prohibited personnel practices?
The prohibited personnel practice case was recently settled with the FAA, and I was allowed to transfer away from Memphis to Austin, Texas.
And is that working out for you?
Yeah, it is. The people at Austin are treating me really nice, and it's kind of nice to be back in Texas. And so I'm kind of hoping that the dust will settle a little bit from that, and I can carry on with my career.
Okay. Any regrets about having come forward?
No regrets. I mean, it's been very difficult. If I had it to do all over again, I'm not sure what I would do. But
and why is that?
I guess it's one of those kind of things. If somebody was to tell you what your life would be like if you go through a certain course of action, I think that if we knew beforehand, I think that many of us may not take those steps.
And what were the worst things that happened to you? What was the most difficult for you to deal with personally?
It was just absolutely humiliating to be accused of animal cruelty.
And what exactly was that charge?
It's a long story, but essentially, I took my dog to work one day on a day shift because the dog was sick, and the FAA would not allow me time off from work to take my dog to the veterinary clinic. And it was just me. I have no family in Memphis. And at work, I checked on the dog every hour when I was on break. And one of the facility managers called the Humane Society and just made an accusation of animal cruelty because I had the dog in the truck, in a kennel in the truck at work. And so the animal cruelty investigator came out to investigate, took one look at me, took one look at the dog, realized that the dog was healthy but yet sick. And so we immediately went inside. He talked to the managers, and
I got to tell you, in my line of work, I hear a lot of stories and a lot of ways of retaliating against employees who speak out about important issues. I have never before heard of somebody being charged with animal cruelty as a means of retaliation.
I mean, it's ridiculous. I laugh about it now, but it was just the beginning of a long series of acts of false accusations by the FAA. But of course, the animal cruelty investigator, he knew there was nothing up, and he ordered the FAA to allow me to leave work right then and there so I could go care for my dog.
Now, you're part of an alliance of FAA employees.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I recently joined a group of other FAA whistleblowers, and we have formed a group called the FAA Whistleblower Alliance. And essentially, it's a group of FAA employees who have filed complaints against the agency through the Office of Special Counsel or through the Department of Transportation Office of the Inspector General. And we exist as kind of a support group for each other to share stories, to share tactics and strategies, and to just support each other as we go through this process. It's a lonely process, and we feel that we can help each other by sharing our background and past experiences with us.
Yeah, we certainly appreciate it and appreciate the work of Peter Nesbitt and his colleagues in the FAA Whistleblower Alliance. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Whistle Where You Work.